The morning I signed the papers for the Harrington Wing, I was wearing my old university hoodie and eating a meat pie in my car. That's the thing no one tells you about building something real. The moments that change everything rarely look the way you imagined they would. There's no orchestra, no slow clap. Just you, a slightly soggy pastry, and a pen that almost ran out of ink on the most important signature of your life. My name is Brianna Tawiri. I'm 31 years old. And for most of my family's memory, I was the one who threw it all away. Let me take you back to the beginning, not the dramatic part, not yet, but the part that made the dramatic part inevitable. I grew up in Palmerston North, third of 4 kids, in a household where success had a very specific shape. My older brother Marcus went to Massey and studied engineering. My sister Delia married a solicitor in Wellington and had 2 children by 28. My younger brother Cole was still in school when all of this happened, young enough that he hadn't yet been assigned his role in the family narrative. And then there was me. I left university after 18 months, not because I failed my grades were fine, actually better than fine, but because I could see, with a clarity that almost frightened me, that the path I was on would take me somewhere I didn't want to go. I was studying business administration, sitting in lectures about organizational theory, and all I kept thinking was that the most interesting thing in that room was the problem I'd been sketching in the margins of my notebook for 3 weeks. The problem was this: regional hospitals in New Zealand were losing community donors because the donation process was too fragmented, too impersonal, too slow. People wanted to give. The infrastructure made it too hard. I thought I could fix that. I went home for the summer and told my parents I was taking a gap year to work on something. My mother set down her cup of tea very carefully, the way she did when she was choosing her words. My father asked if I'd been talking to anyone about this. A counselor, he meant. My Aunt Colleen, who happened to be visiting that weekend, said, and I remember this precisely, "Well, at least Delia's sorted." I smiled and said I'd see them at Christmas. I moved to Auckland, found a flatmate through a Facebook group, and started working. The next several years were not glamorous. I'm not going to dress them up and pretend the struggle was cinematic. There were months I ate rice and frozen vegetables 5 nights a week. There were investor meetings where I could see the exact moment the person across the table decided I was too young, too inexperienced, too much of a risk. There was a period of about 8 months, around year 3, where I genuinely considered whether I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But here's the thing about building something in a space people have ignored. The bar for entry is low, and if you're paying attention, you can see exactly what needs to exist. I could see it. Every time I hit a wall, I could still see it. By the time I was 26, my platform, which connected regional healthcare facilities with community donors through a streamlined, personalized giving system, was processing over $4 million in donations annually. Small by some standards, enormous by mine. By 28, we had partnerships with 11 DHBs across the North Island. By 30, we had signed our first major institutional contract with a private hospital group, and I had quietly, deliberately, moved most of my personal assets into a holding structure that my accountant had helped me design, not to hide anything, just because I'd learned, early on, that privacy was a form of protection. When people don't know what you have, they can't find reasons to have opinions about how you got it or what you should do with it. My family knew I worked in tech or healthcare stuff or some kind of app. I hadn't corrected them, not out of spite, truly not out of spite, but because whenever I had tried to explain it, the conversation had moved quickly to whether I regretted leaving university, whether I'd thought about going back, whether I was seeing anyone, whether I was eating properly. It was easier to let them think what they thought, until the reunion. My mother's side of the family held a gathering every 2 years, rotating between whoever had the most space. In the February of my 31st year, it landed at my Uncle Robert's place in Havelock North, a nice property, big section, the kind of house that signaled comfortable, established success. The sort of success my family understood and respected. I drove down from Auckland on the Friday evening. I had a meeting in Wellington the following Monday that I hadn't mentioned to anyone. The gathering was already in full swing when I arrived. My cousin Steph met me at the door with a hug and a glass of something sparkling, And for the first 15 minutes, everything was warm and easy. The cousins I actually liked, the uncle who always asked interesting questions, the smell of a proper roast drifting out from the kitchen. Then I made my way further into the room. My Aunt Colleen was holding court near the bookshelf, which was her preferred location at these events because it gave her a backdrop that communicated something about her values without her having to say it directly. She was talking to my cousin Jeremy and his wife about property. Of course she was talking about property. In New Zealand in the last decade, property was the language of a particular kind of success, and my Aunt Colleen was fluent in it. Values have just kept climbing in Havelock North, she was saying. Robert's place has nearly doubled. Of course, you have to be in the market to benefit. She said that last part, with a particular inflection that meant it was aimed at someone specific. I got a glass of water from the sideboard. Brianna, my aunt turned. You made it. Still in Auckland? Still in Auckland. Renting? Still? I took a sip of water. She waited, as if I'd finished the sentence differently. I didn't. My cousin Jeremy's wife, her name was Annabelle, and she had always been kinder to me than the situation required, asked what I was working on these days. Healthcare technology, I said. Mostly in the donor engagement space. So, like a startup? Jeremy said. Something like that. My aunt made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You know, I was reading that most of those don't actually make money for years. Sometimes never. That's true of some of them, I said. Delia's done so well, she said, pivoting with the ease of long practice. Did you see she and Fraser are looking at a second property? Investment, not to live in. Very smart at their age. I told her Delia deserved it. I meant it. Delia had worked hard and made choices that suited her, and I didn't begrudge her any of it. My aunt looked at me with an expression I'd spent my whole life cataloging. It was the look that said she found my composure slightly suspicious. I excused myself to find my mother. The next morning was when things shifted. The family had the easy rhythm of the second-day breakfast was leisurely. The kids were running around the garden. Someone had started a cricket game on the back lawn. I was sitting at the long table on the deck with my cousin Steph and her partner Hemi, drinking good coffee and enjoying the particular pleasure of being somewhere green after weeks of concrete and screen light. My Uncle Robert came out and settled into a chair at the head of the table. He was a decent man, my Uncle Robert. Not unkind, but the kind of person who absorbed the opinions of the room and reflected them back with the authority of someone who assumed he'd arrived at them independently. He poured himself coffee and looked out at the garden. Beautiful morning. My cousin Jeremy had followed him out. The Harrington development? That's the one. My uncle nodded. Regional private facility. Supposed to be world-class. They're doing something unusual with the funding some kind of charitable trust structure. Not all private capital. Steph looked up from her phone. I heard the anchor donor is completely anonymous. No one knows who it is. A foundation, my uncle said. Based in Auckland, apparently. No one seems to know much about it. I looked at the garden. My cousin Jeremy sat down. The hospital board must know. Sure, the board. But publicly? Nothing. My uncle shook his head with the mild irritation of someone accustomed to knowing things. It's unusual. Normally these donors want the recognition. Naming rights? Plaques. The whole thing. There's a naming, Steph said, reading from her phone now. The Harrington Wing. But the foundation chose to name it after a nurse who worked in the region for 40 years. Not after the donor. There was a moment of silence. In it, the cricket game continued on the lawn. My Aunt Colleen had come to the doorway. Well, that's either very noble or very strange, she said. Why give that much money and not take the credit? My uncle shrugged. Some people just don't need it. Or they have something to hide, my aunt said. I drank my coffee. Hemi, who had been quiet through this whole conversation, glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hemi was perceptive. He'd always been perceptive. What do you think, Brie? He said. Everyone looked at me. I think some people just prefer to do things quietly, I said. The work matters. The credit doesn't always have to. My aunt tilted her head. Easy to say when you haven't built anything worth taking credit for. She didn't say it cruelly. That was the strange thing. I don't think she even meant it as an attack. She said it with the casual certainty of someone who had simply decided, years ago, what kind of person I was, and had never found reason to update that assessment. The table was quiet for a beat. My uncle cleared his throat and redirected the conversation toward Jeremy's new car. I stood up to refill my coffee inside. Steph followed me. She waited until we were in the kitchen and the door had swung shut behind us. Then she leaned against the counter and looked at me with the expression she'd had since we were teenagers, the one that meant she already knew, and was waiting to see what I'd do with it. "It's you, isn't it?" she said. It wasn't really a question. I looked at her. "The foundation," she said. "The Harrington Wing." I filled my cup. "Why would you think that?" "Because I Googled your company name 2 weeks ago when I was filling out a form for our local health charity, and it came up as a recommended platform. And then I kept reading." She paused. "Bri, your company processes donations for half the North Island." I turned around and leaned against the counter across from her. "It does. And the Harrington Wing is part of a larger initiative we're supporting, yes." Steph looked at me for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 5 years of actual scale. Before that, 3 years of building. And you just let them all assume." "I didn't correct anyone," I said. "That's not the same as deceiving them." She was quiet for a moment. "What's the foundation called?" I told her. She looked it up on her phone. I watched her read. I watched her face change. "Bree," she said softly, "it's not a big deal. Your annual grant disbursements are. I know what they are." She put her phone down. "You know Mum is out there implying you've never built anything." "I know. Doesn't that?" She paused, searching. "Doesn't that bother you?" I thought about it honestly. The way I'd learned to think about these things. Not the reflexive reassurance, but the actual answer. "It used to," I said. "For a long time it used to bother me more than I admitted. I wanted them to see it. I wanted the acknowledgement. I think most people do, when they've worked for something." I paused. But somewhere in the last few years I realized I'd built everything I built without their acknowledgement, and it hadn't stopped me. So what did I actually need it for? Steph was watching me carefully. "The Harrington Wing is named after a nurse called Margaret Harrington, who worked in that region for 40 years, and almost no one outside it knows her name," I said. "She deserved the recognition more than I did." That felt right. It still feels right. My cousin nodded slowly. Then she straightened up. "So what do we do now?" "We go back outside," I said. "And we have a nice day." She blinked. "That's it?" "That's it." We went back outside. The morning continued. The cricket game ended. My aunt held forth on property values twice more. My Uncle Robert checked his phone for news about the Harrington development and read aloud a paragraph about the Foundation's community engagement model without appearing to register the irony. My mother asked me if I was eating enough and whether Auckland was lonely. I told her Auckland was fine. In the afternoon, the conversation at the adult table turned to what everyone's children were doing, the particular tournament of ambition that happens when a generation of parents gathers together and needs to account for the investments they've made in human beings. Delia's name came up. Marcus's promotion came up. Jeremy's property acquisition came up. My name came up. "Brianna's still in the startup world," my aunt said, with the tone of someone describing a phase a person ought to have grown out of. "Healthcare technology," my mother said, loyally but vaguely. "It's a hard space," my uncle said, not unkindly. I sat at the end of the table and watched the late afternoon light move across the garden. Then my cousin Jeremy's wife Annabelle careful Annabelle said, "Actually, I looked up what Brianna's company does earlier. It's quite impressive. A small shift in the atmosphere." My aunt looked up. "You did?" "She mentioned it this morning. Donor engagement for healthcare, right, Bri?" Annabelle met my eyes with a quiet steadiness. "They work with a lot of DHBs. And apparently there's a foundation connected to the company. I think I recognize the name from the Harrington Wing announcement." The table was quiet. My Uncle Robert looked at me. I held his gaze evenly. "The Tawiri Foundation?" he said slowly. It wasn't a question either. He'd connected it himself. "Yes," I said. "You're the anchor donor for the Harrington facility." "The foundation is, yes." My Aunt Colleen had gone very still. But the foundation my uncle started is mine, yes. The cricket kids were still playing on the lawn. A tui called somewhere in the trees beyond the fence. The afternoon went on around us with no interest in our small moment of reckoning. My aunt looked at me across the table with an expression I'd never quite seen from her before. Not shame. I don't think my Aunt Colleen had a well-developed relationship with shame, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of realizing the map you've been using doesn't match the territory. You never said anything, she said. You never asked, I said, gently. My mother was looking at me with an expression I had fewer words for. Something complicated love and surprise, and maybe a thread of grief for all the Sunday phone calls where she'd asked if I was doing okay, and I'd said yes, and she'd accepted that without pushing. Steph was looking at the garden. I could see the corner of her mouth. My uncle cleared his throat. Well, he said. That's something, Brianna. It's just work, I said. It's what I do. Jeremy said something about always knowing I'd land on my feet. I smiled because he meant well, even if what he was actually doing was retroactively adjusting the story he'd been telling about me. My aunt asked, after a pause, whether the donation was tax-structured. I told her it was. She nodded with the appreciation of someone filing that information away. It was, I realized, the most natural response I could have hoped for from her. She would process this through the lens of what she understood, and what she understood was financial architecture. That was fine. My mother reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. She didn't say anything, but she held on for a moment longer than necessary, and I understood everything in it, the apology she couldn't quite find words for, and the pride that was finding them. After dinner, when the evening had gone long and easy, when the children had been put to bed, and the adults had broken into smaller conversations around the room, my Uncle Robert found me on the deck alone. He stood beside me for a while. We looked at the Hawke's Bay dark no-city glow here, just the particular velvet quality of a clear rural night. I should have asked more questions, he said eventually. Over the years. You asked plenty, I said. I wasn't always forthcoming. Still. He was quiet for a moment. The foundation. When did you set it up? About 4 years ago. When the company reached a point where I could sustain it properly. He nodded. And the Harrington Wing, that was a deliberate choice? Naming it after her? Margaret Harrington spent 40 years doing work that made a regional health system function better. Most of the people who benefited from that work don't know her name. Felt like something worth fixing. He looked at me for a long moment. Your grandfather would have liked that, he said. I hadn't expected that. Something shifted, quietly, in my chest. I'd like to think so, I said. We stood there for another few minutes without needing to fill the space, which was its own kind of resolution. I drove back to Auckland on the Sunday evening. The Monday meeting in Wellington was a formality. We were finalizing the second stage funding structure for the Harrington facility, a meeting that would happen in a building that bore the foundation's name, but not mine, in a wing named for a woman most of the people in that room had never heard of. On the way home, somewhere past Taupo, I thought about what Steph had asked me in the kitchen. Whether it bothered me. The honest answer, the one I hadn't quite finished out loud, was that it used to bother me because I was looking for their certainty to replace my own doubts. When I was 20, 22, 24, working in a flat that smelled like the neighbors cooking, sending emails into silence, rebuilding the same broken feature for the third time, I wanted someone from my family to say, with conviction, that I was on the right track. Not because their opinion would have changed the track, but because doubt is heavy, and company makes it lighter. The thing is, they couldn't have given me that. They didn't know what I was building. And even if they had, they would have been afraid of it, afraid for me, which would have looked from the outside exactly like being dismissive of me. Fear and dismissal wear the same expression at the dinner table. I learned to carry my doubt alone. And somewhere in the carrying, I stopped noticing its weight. What I know now, what I would tell anyone in that early stage, grinding in the invisible years, when nothing has been validated yet, and the only thing sustaining you is your own vision, is this. The acknowledgement you crave from the people who underestimated you is not the same as the acknowledgement you actually need. The acknowledgement you actually need is the knowledge that the thing you saw, which no one else could see yet, was real. And the only way to get that knowledge is to build it into existence. No one can give it to you in advance. No family gathering, no reassurance, no moment of being believed before you've earned the evidence. None of it works as a substitute for doing the thing, which means the years when no one believes you are not the years before the work. They are the work. The people who underestimate you are not your antagonists. Most of them love you in the only way they've learned how. They are working from incomplete information, from a map that was drawn before you became who you are. That's not malice. That's just the ordinary limitation of people who haven't been where you're going. Your job is not to correct them early. Your job is to go. Somewhere outside Taupo, the road opened up and the stars were extraordinary, and I thought about Margaret Harrington, who worked 40 years and didn't wait for a naming rights deal to decide it was worth it. I thought about all the people who would walk through that wing and not know whose money built it and be helped anyway. That seemed like enough. It had always seemed like enough. That's the thing no one tells you about quiet success. It doesn't feel like the revenge fantasy you imagined when you were 23 and eating frozen vegetables and wondering if you'd made a catastrophic mistake. It doesn't feel like triumph over the people who doubted you. It doesn't feel like the moment at the table when my uncle said your name differently. It feels like driving home through a dark and beautiful country at 9 o'clock on a Sunday, knowing that something real exists in the world that didn't exist before you built it. It feels like enough. It feels, honestly, like more than enough.